I'll never forget, my mom went up. I think my dad was working that weekend because he wasn't there. And so I remember going up with my mom because, I don't know, mom grabbed me and I went up with her, right?
Trust mom.
And he's praying over everybody. And he's going down the line, putting hands on them, and they're like falling out, slain in the spirit. And he comes to me and he puts his hand on, let's say, 10-year-old Chip's head and starts praying for me. And I'm just standing, and then he kind of like gives a little nudge, a little push, and I'm just like standing, and then he does it one more time, and I just kind of shrug and look at him, and he like moves on. So turns out I've been more Baptist before everybody in my family, I guess,
Welcome to Let's Talk About That, the podcast where we take a deeper dive into Sunday's message and explore any questions you might have. I'm your host, AJ Stevens, joined by lead pastor Chip Parker, and I'm thrilled to be on this journey with you. Whether you're a longtime member of the Orchard or a first-time visitor, Let's Talk About That is your space to explore, reflect, and connect. Join us as we navigate the intricacies of faith, spirituality, and daily life, seeking to understand how the wisdom shared on Sundays can be applied to our modern challenges. So grab a cup of coffee, find a comfortable space, and let's dive in together. This is Let's Talk About That, where the conversation about Sunday's message never stops. Well, Chip, it is Friday at 1:06 p.m., and I am reminded why we do podcasts on Monday.
Yeah, I get that. And why are we doing a podcast on Friday instead of Monday mornings when we normally do our podcast?
Well, I will be out next week with the week of my year that brings me the least amount of sleep at student camp. So that's where I will be next week.
So you're taking our students from all locations to student camp at...
Camp Anderson. No, not Camp Anderson. This is where I'm at right now.
Yeah.
Because I just came back from Camp Anderson, but Anderson University in South Carolina, in Anderson, South Carolina is where we're going. Not to be confused with the camp that I just came from, which is Camp Anderson in Old Town, Florida. So,
which you've been at for a week, preaching that camp down there, not our church camp, just a camp locally. And you were the camp pastor for the week. And so I got to be honest, I'm kind of excited to see you a little bit this tired going off to student camp. It's going to make for a phenomenal week for the kids.
Oh, man.
I love that. And shout out to Camp Anderson on the Swanee River. Friend of the podcast, John Egan, is the camp director down there, and it's a cool place. That's where we do Bold Weekend every year. And I will just say, bonus for being a podcast listener, it's where we're going to be doing a secret church event later this year. We'll talk about that later.
I love it, yeah. No, man, I was really impressed with what John's got going on down there. It was cool. It was fun. You go down there as camp pastor and you don't have any, obligations outside of teaching. And so it's nice because next week I will have lots of obligations and they will all have names and I will need to make sure they're all accounted for. And I'll be with Lucas and Eddie, but, we're going to be chipping away and dividing and conquering, and you have to care for those kids. When you're the camp pastor, you don't have to care for those kids per se. I have to teach those kids, and I get to hang out with those kids, and that's different, and there's less responsibility involved in that. And so I'm tired because I decided to hang out, and I was up with them, and I was playing with them, and we were having a good time, but I'm not tired in the sense that, I'm exhausted because I was just chasing Rugrats everywhere, which will be next week.
Yeah, student camp is always an interesting thing. I had my share of years at student camp. When I was the pastor at Airline Baptist Church in Mayo, I worked with the students for 8 of the 10 years I was there, and I took those kids to camp during the summer. And I kid you not, man, there was one kid that I took to camp that we took to the emergency room 3 years in a row.
Just a walking accident.
3 years in a row. 1 year, we were on St. George Island at a camp on St. George Island, kind of doing a camp just our church.
That's Panhandle, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a barrier island out near Apalachicola.
Yep.
And so he was walking on the beach, stepped on an oyster shell, sliced his foot open.
That's all she wrote.
1 year, we were at a Fuge camp in Panama City, and we were in a pool. And he was trying to impress girls and tried to do a flip and didn't get his head all the way in the pool and cracked his head open.
Brother.
Had to go to the ER. I don't remember what the third one was. By that point, it was nobody cared. Anyway,
Hey, man, sympathy points are gone.
Just send him back. It's fine.
There's a song that reminds me of a song. I don't remember who sings it. It's a country song. It's called Chicks Dig It. And
that's right.
Scars heal, glory fades, and all we're left is all the memories made, baby.
That's
right.
Just
living that.
All right, so you may be too young for this.
Okay.
Do you remember the Greg Maddux, Tom Glavine commercial that was on TV back when they were pitchers for the Braves?
So, no, I don't remember it from my childhood, but yes, I've seen it air like they just showed it. I want to say for a big sporting event, they brought it back to life.
Really?
Or maybe it was on social media, but I saw the long ball. Yeah, that's right.
It was
that's
like
right.
Mark McGuire.
Or it was you that made us watch it.
Maybe it was.
That's what it was. Yeah. I don't remember. It was you. I think in a staff meeting, you're like, "Hey, you guys need to watch this if you've never seen it." It's actually
it's great stuff.
Yeah.
It's great stuff. So yeah. Anyway, why are we talking about Chicks Iglo? Oh, Scars.
Yeah.
Camp
Because
You're
Kent
going to
Murphy
camp.
doesn't want you to bunt.
It's great.
Yeah,
It's great.
It'll be good. Well, I'm excited. Lucas just called me actually, and so I'm sure that was camp related because we got people backing out last minute, and we're trying to fill those spots, and it's just the chaos. So show your student pastor a little extra grace this week if you're.
I'm just going to throw this out there because it's a podcast and it's a selective audience that is hearing this. But I always just kind of smirk internally. I don't know, maybe externally. I can't see my face. When a parent is like, man, it's just been so stressful getting them to camp. And it's just been, I'm so nervous getting to camp. Like, I don't think the average parent knows the amount of work that goes into getting kids to camp.
Yeah.
Like, it's not, hey, let's load up and roll, like it's a chore.
Yeah.
And then you get there and you're actually at camp for a week.
Here's exactly, this got to come to life. So being the camp pastor and being like the camp chaperone, whatever, that's in charge of two different things. This week, one of the student pastors that was there with his church, there was one night where they ended up with like 4 kids in the sick bay at one time. And one of the kids was on the way to the sick bay, was like, I don't think I need to go in the hospital or anything. I think I'll be fine. Passes out, gets up, and is like, okay, I'm fine. Everything's fine. And he starts to walk out, and he passes out again. And they call the ambulance, and he passes out on the way to the ambulance, I think. And like, I'm just like watching the student pastor, and I'm like, this dude is stressing because now you've got an ambulance ride, you've got IVs, it's an insurance nightmare. HR at his church is probably like, oh my gosh, all we had to do is not like give these kids water kind of thing. And like, it's just, that was the difference was I'm here to have fun. I don't have to deal with any of that nonsense this week.
Fair enough.
You do.
Fair enough. So while we're talking about camp, why do you think camp is important? Like, because I know you guys listen to this don't, have these conversations, but we have these conversations around the office. And the question that's come up over the last few years is camp becoming something of the past? I mean, because as a church, we don't have as many people go to camp as we used to, and we're having more people on Sundays than we ever have. And so it's kind of like, well, that's not just us though. It's every camps, and you've had camps shut down. You've had camps get bought out. And so are camps still relevant? What do you think is the value of camp?
Yeah, I mean, you say this, I say this, we all say this, a change of place and a change of pace, it brings a change of perspective. And I think for me, that's the kicker, right? It's the parents telling your kids something all the time, and then they hear from somebody else, and there's like a light bulb moment. And that's, I think, what happens for a lot of our students, a lot of our kids. They've been hearing a familiar voice, and that's a good thing, and that voice has been investing. But sometimes they need to get out of the normal, and they'll hear things in a fresh way. And so I think that's a big part of it. Man, I think that this week reminded me just how important that is and how valuable that is, because you have these guys, these leaders, and there's a moment for kids at camp where they get together and they're sitting next to their friends and they're in small group all week, and there's no distractions. Yeah. And I think when there's no distractions and they look next to them and they say, man, this guy's not distracted and she's not distracted and we're all just worshiping Jesus together, I think that's some of the value in camp is. And I also think that's part of the reason camps are dying is because there's so many distractions. Now, mom and dad aren't willing to give up that week to go send their kid to camp and invest that way, I guess, in a way. And so, I don't know. I think it's a big conversation. I have thoughts and opinions, but I think that's some of it. The distractions are.
I know. I think part of it, too, is as a church, we cover half of every kid that goes to camp. And I don't think most people realize that because it's still so expensive, even with the church just paying half up front. But then when we have to ask for deposits to get our deposits into the camp, we have to ask for them super early. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of parents that are like, I don't know if I want to commit to that. Yeah. Like, it's January, it's November. Like, what am I'm going to have to wait for camp this summer. But the reality, I mean, we have to plan that long to get kids to camp and to make it work. And so it's hard. Do you ever worry about like the camp experience for students and then it just going away and not being a thing? Like, is that like how do you process that? Because it is a thing. That's not what I'm asking, but how do you how do you handle that? How much do you worry about that?
For me, I think this is why so let me say this. I've been in several contexts where I worry about it differently, and I think you worry about it as much as you're prepared to handle it. And so if you have a good group of leaders who you trust and are willing to invest on the backside of the camp experience, then I don't sweat it as much. If you're uncertain and things are a little bit unstable, or you don't know those kids, right? Those kids just came to camp with us, but they don't go to our church. Yeah, I do worry about that a little bit, because here's a moment that ends up being a moment instead of the beginning of a journey, right? And I think if they don't have a consistent voice speaking into them, then it's really easy for them to, wow, this is awesome. A week later, there goes the camp high. Oh, well, my normal is everything that I just said was bad and trying to fight against. And so then they get sucked right back in. But I think it's important to have those influences in that team around you. And this is why we are set up the way we're set up, with small group leaders and everything else, constantly being a second voice and trying to love on those kids consistently.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think for me, one of the things that I've constantly struggled with is that just emotional high and it going away. And, you know, even before I was a full-time pastor, I worked with the church while I was in college with their student group during the summers, and I would take them to camp. And I swear, like there was this one girl, she got saved both years I took them to camp. And every time we had a youth service with a special speaker, you know, and so you worry about that. And I mean, honestly, because nobody knows who I'm talking about, except maybe my wife, she might be the only one who knows who I'm talking about. The girl's life isn't going great right now as an adult, you know, either. Yeah. And so you got to worry about that. But at the same time, as I've gotten older in ministry and been around ministry longer, man, I think most of those are emotional experiences. I think a lot of kids that have those big experiences, most of them fade. But I've come to realize the importance of, well, some of them stick. You know, it doesn't have to be all of them, but some of them stick. Like some of these kids are going to come back from camp and a switch will be flipped in their life. Yeah. You know, and it doesn't have to be a big emotional experience. It can be a small thing, but for as much as doesn't stick with the camp experience, there is some that does. Yeah. And that's eternally valuable.
It's such a, man, to me, it's not like an isolated conversation, camp. I think it's part of a bigger conversation, because one of the other things that I'd like to say is proximity equals priority. And so for these kids, like a lot of them are set up to fail, because here's what a lot of parents will do. They'll say, hey, I'm just going to send you to church on Wednesday and I hope they fix you. Or I'm just going to send you to kids' church on Sunday and I hope they fix you. Or I'm just going to send you to camp for a week and I hope that they fix you.
I hope that 1 hour a week, 1 week a year can undo everything that we've neglected, you know.
Right, exactly. And so then what happens is, okay, yeah, we did have a moment and we did have an epiphany and we did have a breakthrough, but proximity equals priority. And so when you go back home, now you're not in that environment anymore, and the normal is everything else. And so it's like, all right, parents, we want to partner with you, and this is why I say it's part of a bigger conversation, because we want to come alongside the parents and say, now here's how you keep your kid moving that direction, because we cannot undo in 1 hour what you've done the other 40 hours of the week, right, as you spend time with them.
1 week a year doesn't undo 51 weeks a year.
Which is why we want to partner with you, and we want to walk through this with you, and that's why I'm saying bigger conversation. I think the way your church is set up is going to make a difference on how camp is handled, student ministry is handled, all that kind of stuff. So
I think that is a good point, because what we try to do is, you know, a lot of my experiences with camps over the years, with churches I've taken, churches I've seen, is whoever's off that week volunteers to go to camp, right? But at the Orchard, I don't know the last time that we've taken somebody to student camp or kids camp that hasn't been an active volunteer. That's a lot. I do remember one particular who had a special reason they needed to go. Yeah. But beyond that, everybody that we take to kids camp and student camp they're plugged into the ministry, and those kids see them regularly in their student ministry. So camp's good. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it'll be good.
You're going to come back even more tired than you left, which is going to be great.
But then on the backside of that, we have family vacation, which sounds like a vacation, but with a pregnant wife and 2 kids, it's probably going to be more like dragging a giant sled full of stuff across the beach, and it's not going to be relaxing, I should say.
I will say, AJ, there comes a time in a beach dad's life when you just get up first thing in the morning, because it's not 1,000,000 degrees, the beach is empty, and you just go set everything up. That way you can tell them, y'all knock it out when you get ready. And, you know,
that's a good word.
It took me a while to get there, but, you know, you just turned 30 this year. It's coming. One of these days, AJ is going to be one of those dads out stretching on the balcony, watching the sun come up. Time to set up for the day.
That's right. Yeah, and I hate the beach, if I'm being honest with you. I
hate the beach.
But I've learned that I need it, so it'll be good. But I'll just say, it's relatively exhausting week leading into what's going to be an exhausting week, but both of those things have a ton of spiritual benefit, and that's why we do what we do. So it'll be good.
Good stuff.
It'll be good. But I want to pivot a little bit here, because I think we've been talking about the Spirit, and I still...
We have?
Yeah, a little bit. Poquito. I still believe there are several elements to this conversation that A, we're not going to get to, and B, that people want to at least hear a conversation about. And so here's how I want to start this, because one of the things that is always intriguing to me about you is your background, right? Because now you're the lead pastor at a church that affiliates Southern Baptist, right? And
I mean, they don't really claim us all the time.
Yeah.
But, you know,
we claim them, they don't claim us. Yeah, for sure. But that's not always been the trajectory, right, of your
I have a
spiritual
unique
life.
spiritual journey of the churches that I have attended for my life.
Yeah. And so because of that, it's intriguing to me. Let me say, and you can disagree, but I do think experience lends us one way or the other, right? Like sometimes experience influences what we think.
The most unbiased, or the most biased we are, is about how we think we're unbiased.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like not all of this shapes how we see and think about everything.
100%. And so I want to know, as a guy who grew up in, air quotes, a charismatic church, right? Do you have any stories? Do you have any stories of like moments where you saw the opposite of what we're talking about and you saw things just kind of going haywire and, man, this is the Spirit, but you're like, that's definitely not the Spirit, that kind of stuff?
Well, I will say I have a very eclectic church background. The first church that I remember attending regularly as a kid was an independent but loosely independent Baptist church in Perry. Matter of fact, I didn't realize they were independent until I was an adult. I always thought they were Southern Baptist because, I mean, honestly, like doctrine, practice, they look like every other Baptist church in town. They just, I don't think, have ever affiliated.
Oh.
But we didn't attend there too long. But, you know, being a small, you know, country Baptist church, you know, you have the special music that you have, you know, in churches. And every time somebody would sing special music, after they'd get done singing, we'd clap, you know, and then the preacher would come up to do the message. Well, I'll never forget, the next church we attended was an independent Baptist church, but it may be what you call like a hard shell independent Baptist. I don't know if you ever heard that term.
No.
Their own denomination, it was my grandparents' church, was called a Baptist Purity Church. Okay. So almost think like a Baptist holiness kind of church, like a, you know, women wore dresses, men wore shirts buttoned up to the collar. Women didn't. A lot of the older women in church never cut their hair. They you know, they let it grow, like very in that holiness stream, but Baptist theology, at least somewhat Baptist theology around it. But I'll never forget as a kid that after someone sang special music in that church, the first time I'm there, I'm probably 5, 6 years old. I can't be much older than that. I just start, you know, clapping it up,
baby. Yeah.
And guess who's the only guy clapping in the church?
You.
And everybody turns and looks, and I was like, yeah, oh, all right. So so we went from like maybe like we would say a normal, what a lot of us would see a normal Baptist church, to a very conservative, strict kind of holiness Baptist church, to a charismatic church, so non-denominational charismatic church.
Yeah, why did y'all pivot? Like, what's the just family thing? I mean, if it's too personal,
no, I mean, honestly, I have no idea why we left the first one. I just think I don't think we were ever, I was too young to really know. I don't think we were ever super plugged in there.
Yeah.
The other one we attended because that's where my mom's family attended. And we're still connected to that church with family connections to this day. When my grandpa passed away, that was the last of my mom's parents. He passed away right around Christmas, and we did the funeral there. The pastor, who was the pastor then, is still the pastor now. Wow. He and I, you know, did the service together. So there's still connections there, but it just wasn't, you know, I'll just say it wasn't the right fit for our family. We love a lot of the people there, but we wound up going to this non-denominational charismatic church in town that was really close to where we live, like right down the road. My mom's oldest brother and his family attended there. My dad had friends that attended there, and so it was a good fit for us. And that is the church that, when I think back, kind of is the church I feel like I grew up in. We were there for probably 5 or 6 years. I was saved while we were at that church, but it was a charismatic church. And I will say, in my experience now, kind of seeing the gamut of churches, I don't think it was not a charismatic church like you may think of, just like a super expressive, ecstatic, just crazy stuff happening all the time. I mean, it wasn't. It was charismatic in the fact that they spoke in tongues. There was prophecy. It was very much looser than, you know, a lot of the non-charismatic services. But I don't ever remember like services like going off the rails and stuff getting crazy. It was it was a charismatic church, but it was probably more on the conservative side of that. Not
Conservative,
like not
charismatic
like
church.
conservative liberal kind of thing,
Right,
but
right.
just like more buttoned up, more restrained. That's the word, right? Like a more restrained.
Okay, that's
charismatic
good.
church.
So let me ask you this, and because I want to get your stories, and I don't want to hijack you too much, but
You're good.
for some people, and I think for a long time I was one of these people, so that's what I'm saying. For some people,
Yeah.
there's the idea that like, well, all charismatic churches look the same, and so, but there seems to be a spectrum, right?
So
From
there-
like,
there is a spectrum. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about in this series, but it's maybe an important distinction to make. Like, I think people use the term charismatic and Pentecostal interchangeably.
yeah, sure,
They're not.
yeah,
Now I will say in most people's experience, they're probably interchangeable, quote unquote, but by definition, they're not, because the charismatic movement is a later movement than the Pentecostal movement. The Pentecostal movement is a still relatively modern movement inside evangelical churches, but it was started out in Azusa Street revivals out in California and spread from there into Church of God, Assemblies of God, Church of God of Prophecy, like a lot of those churches. And as best I understand it, Pentecostal theology proper, right? So I say that because I'm sure Pentecostals are just like Baptist. Okay, this is what Baptists, quote unquote, believe.
Right.
But then there's distinction. So I'm not putting this on anybody in particular. But Pentecostal theology proper is the best I understand. It says that speaking in tongues is evidence of the second baptism of the Spirit,
right,
where after you've been saved, at some point, if you are a good, mature, godly Christian, you are going to receive the filling of the Holy Spirit and you will speak in tongues.
which probably produces some anxiety for Christians in the Pentecostal circle because
It absolutely does, and I have talked to many.
if you haven't spoken tongues yet, then it's saying, well, you don't have evidence of the Spirit in your life, and so then you start to question your salvation in general, right?
Well, they also believe that you can lose your salvation.
Yeah.
And so that is kind of more Pentecostal theology proper. Charismatic theology is a later stream of a movement that is, let's say, more open to the Spirit and sign gifts. The charismatic movement will embrace prophecy and healings and tongues, much like the Pentecostal movement. But the key difference is they believe that tongues are a gift of the Spirit.
Not the end all be all.
Not everybody's going to speak in tongues. It's not a sign. And to me, and I'll just throw it out there, I'll say what it is. The issue I have with Pentecostal theology proper is it seems like Paul utterly destroys that in what we've just been studying
Right.
in this series.
Specifically, what we're getting to, well, what we will have gotten to after this or before this is aired.
Yeah, well, even in the first week, like, regardless of, let's just say that they believed it wasn't tongues that was the sign that you were filled with the Spirit. Let's just say they believed it was, the spiritual gift of interpretation or the spiritual gift of left-handedness. It doesn't matter what the gift is, right?
Left-handedness.
Well, I mean, if you're a pitcher.
Touche.
But the idea Paul's saying is, hey, none of these gifts are signs of your maturity. None of them are signs of the maturity. They are just, hey, the Spirit's in you. God is going to use the Spirit to show His grace to people around you. None of that is a marker of maturity. And so tongues may be the gift that Pentecostal theology proper focuses on as that sign, but in my understanding of what Paul has been teaching through what we've been going to the series, none of these gifts are to be a mark of maturity
Right.
in the life of the believer.
Which is, and you're saying the charismatic church does not think they're a mark of maturity.
No, the
Right, so-
charismatic church thinks that we are all gifted, but that these gifts are still a part of the gift of the church. Now, again, that practice is going to look different, and I've been in different types of charismatic churches.
Right, the
and
spectrum.
Yeah, and the spectrum. And there are some where, okay, they may not quote-unquote believe that, but 100% that's the way they play it, right? Oh, those are the really spiritual people, man. Look at them, up front and doing all, so anyway, I think theology, practice, whatever, but the church I grew up in was charismatic, not Pentecostal.
Yeah,
Not everybody spoke in tongues. Some did. If somebody spoke in tongues, to the best I can remember, maybe one or two times not, but to the best I can remember, pretty much all the time somebody spoke in tongues. Like there was an interpreter. Somebody came up to interpret, which is what we had just talked about this past Sunday, right?
yeah.
Is that there needs to be an interpreter. We had people who would come into the church and prophesy. You talk about stories. One of the cool stories that I have is there was a prophet, and his name was Leon. I'm trying to remember his last name. I think it was Leon Price. I could reach out to some friends and they would know for sure. But he came to our church several times throughout the years that I was growing up there, and he would always prophesy while he was there. And it was very much, this is what the Lord says to you. You know, I have plans for you, a future and a hope. And so a lot of that is very, I mean, just honestly, guys, if you're listening to this podcast, you know me well enough by now, know how skeptical and cynical I am with everything. A lot of that stuff was just very generic stuff.
Just open-ended enough that it could mean something.
Sure. And I don't think he was doing that, being manipulative. Right. I mean, I think a lot of that generic stuff is generic because, well, it's promises of God for all of us.
Yeah.
But he would get specific about stuff, you know. And, you know, one of the prophecies that I remember is him prophesying over us as a family, my dad, my mom, and me. And he was prophesying about, you know, I see, he's talking about my dad. You know, you've got a, what do they call it? Where the tool they used to beat rocks with, pickaxe, right?
Oh, okay.
He's taking a pickaxe and you're busting up, you know, these big rocks, these big boulders, and you know, your wife, you know, I see you're coming with you've got a refreshing spirit. You've got a tray of ice cold lemonade. You're coming to care for him. And then, you know, Chip, and you, I see you're following in your dad's footsteps, taking the little rocks after he's busted up the big rocks. And so that's, you know, I remember that.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, a few years ago, I actually found a cassette tape because they would record these and then give them to you afterwards. And at one point I went back and listened to it and I still don't remember what he said.
Really?
So I'll have to go back and do it again. But what's funny is, you know, what does that mean? I don't know what it means. You know, the running joke that Dad and I've always had is that, well, if there's two jobs that are always going to have, you know, job security in America, it's going to be police officers and preachers. Yeah. You know,
sure.
People are always trying to go to jail and people are always headed for hell. So we've got two job security. So, you know, there's some joke there. But this guy was a very sincere guy. He was a humble guy. He was not a celebrity type of guy. Sure. You know what I mean? Like, and so it was still very restrained. It was very orderly. It was special stuff. This was almost like a revival. Hey, we have the church service for preaching, but now if anybody wants to stay afterwards, you know, that kind of thing. But I also remember when, you know, Brother Leon was there one time, I was probably like 8, 9, 10 years old at this point. Everybody is up front because he's praying for people, right? And he's laying hands on them if he prays for them. And one of the things that if you grew up in a non-charismatic Pentecostal church, this is totally unfamiliar to you. If you did, it's incredibly familiar to you, is as he was praying for people and laying hands on them, they were being slain in the Spirit.
Okay, so I'm listening. I am unfamiliar, right? You just said slain in the Spirit. What does that mean?
So slain in the Spirit is when you would be so overwhelmed by the Spirit that you would essentially pass out, fall out, right? Some people would be out for a few minutes. Some people would just kind of go down and, you know, get right back up. It happens all the time, like in those types of services, right? And I'll never forget, you know, my mom went up. I think my dad was working that weekend because he wasn't there. And so I remember going up with my mom because, I don't know, Mom grabbed me and I went up with her, right? You know,
trust Mom.
And he's praying over everybody. He's going down the line, putting hands on them, and they're like falling out, slain in the Spirit. And he comes to me and he puts his hand on, let's say, 10-year-old Chip's head and starts praying for me. And I'm just standing. And then he kind of like gives a little nudge, a little push. And I'm just like standing. And then he does it one more time. And I just kind of shrug and look at him. And he like moves on. So turns out I've been more Baptist before everybody in my family, I guess, you know. But it was good. There's still, you know, people that I know and love that attend that church, very godly people. They've invited me to come back and preach there, you know, in the past. I believe they're very genuine in seeking after the Lord. And like I said, it was while I was at that church that I got saved. I don't know if any of you guys know this, a Christian artist by the name of Chris Tomlin. I don't know if you heard that guy. Yeah. You know, if you heard one of his songs, you've heard most of his songs.
Yeah. Yeah. If you listen to Christian radio, I assure you've heard Chris Tomlin's song.
But so when I was in, I believe it was my 7th, 8th grade year of school, I was like 11-ish years old, and I was young for my grade. So right early, right? Perry had just opened up their gymnatorium Okay.
Gymnatorium
It was an auditorium and gym.
with the basketball hoop.
That's right.
All right.
And if you've been to most of these small schools around here, that's what they have. Swanee has a gymnatorium, right? The stage with the bathroom, right? And so our church wanted to do an event there, and our pastor had a friend who was a pastor who also kind of dabbled in, the music scene, and he had a young guy from his church named Chris who was trying to decide if he wanted to be a Christian artist or a country artist.
Brother.
And Chris came to our church in Perry, Florida, and did like a weekend retreat with the students, and then did a concert in the new gymnatorium. And there's two things I remember from that time together. One is, and this wasn't Chris who did this, one of the ladies in our church, as part of the day that the students were spending together, had a tape player, and we were trying to find hidden messages from Satan by listening to rock and roll music on
Like
these tapes.
sped up or whatever.
Yeah, sped up,
backwards.
backwards.
Yeah,
I kid you not. There was a group that was doing that, so I remember that. And then the second thing I remember is that's when I got saved at that Chris Tomlin concert. He was singing the song.
Wait, Chris Tomlin is the guy who was trying to figure out if he was doing country or Christian?
Chris Tomlin's the guy.
Holy crap.
Yeah,
I guess I
Chris
just
Tomlin.
missed that. Yeah.
So is it here in my office? All right, so if we had a camera, I'd show you. You see that poster right there, AJ, the baseball player?
2-chip.
The random, just like generic.
Yeah.
We got it from the Christian bookstore in town because our pastor, had those.
Yeah.
That's Chris Tomlin's signature that he signed that weekend because,
That's crazy.
10-year-old Chip, hey, you got me play guitar and, you should sign something for me.
Chris Tomlin
Chris Tomlin
was in Perry, Florida.
was in Perry, Florida.
That's wild.
Chris Tomlin.
That's nuts.
Matter of fact, we, after he hit it big, years later, went and dug out the CD and was like, holy cow, that's the same guy.
Yeah.
Because none of us could remember if his name was Chris Tomlin or Chris Tomlinson. And we're like, that's close enough. It's worth a look.
it's
And
gotta
so
be.
my cousin had one of his old CDs, and sure enough, it was
crazy.
Chris Tomlin.
All right. Go ahead.
So at this concert, he was singing the song Amazing Grace, but it's not the Amazing Grace, the hymn.
Right.
And it's not the My Chains Are Gone, Amazing Grace. It was Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, amazing love now flowing down from hands and feet that were nailed to a tree. Grace flows down and covers me. Popular song back then.
To clarify.
Late 90s, like 98, 99. And I just remember just being so overwhelmed and convicted by the Spirit. In that moment, I was a good kid. My dad was a cop. I was scared to do bad things because I didn't want to get in trouble. I was, always a straight A student, honor roll, always involved in all stuff. I was a good kid. And I just overwhelmingly, I knew that it was my goodness at that moment that I was depending on for my salvation. And just, in that moment of the song, the grace flows down and covers me. God, I need your grace to cover me. And what's interesting is I'm not even sure that it was an invitation song, but I went down front, and started praying. And then, when I get done, I look around and the stage, people are down there praying, and they take us over to the side of the gym in the bleachers where people from our church are counseling people who've just come forward. So maybe it was an invitation song. I don't know. That part, what if they actually asked us to come forward or whatever, I just knew it didn't matter if they asked or not. I was just so convicted and overwhelmed by the Spirit, realizing, man, I'm lost and I need to be saved. And so they were talking with us, and they were going from person to person. And I'll never forget, a lady, I know who she is. I can tell you her name right now. Looked at me, best intentions of the world, say, oh, Chip, and then moved on to somebody else. Just because she knew me, I went to church there. I was a good kid. I was always in church. But she was talking to all these other people who she didn't know, didn't go to church. All these people just responded, And I get that. There was nothing malicious, but I was kind of left hanging.
Yeah.
And so what I know happened next, but I don't remember the details of, is later, either that night or the next night, in my room, I called my mom into my room and was like, hey, I need to be saved, And for a long time, not remembering that conversation, just remembering, how you remember that it happened, but you don't really remember it. The fact that I couldn't remember that conversation really bothered me. And when God was calling me into the ministry, my senior year, right around there of high school, the reality of my salvation, was I really saved, was just an area in my life that Satan just attacked. And that was one of the footholds he got in, is, well, you don't know what you prayed. You don't know what you said, And that bothered me for a long time. But now, again, looking back, there's no doubt in my mind that when I got saved is at that concert, at that gym, when I felt the conviction of the Spirit and I responded knowing what I needed. Now, I don't know what I prayed. I couldn't remember what I prayed at that stage, but I know, that was it. And I would attribute that to growing up in that charismatic church that taught me to be sensitive to the Spirit, to be sensitive to the Spirit and where the Spirit's leading and that type of conviction. One of the best things I learned and took away from that charismatic church is that God speaks to you and the Spirit is relevant, and this is a personal relationship, not an informal, cold doctrine. Like that was a big thing there. And I didn't realize how important that was until fast forward, our family left the charismatic church after the pastor there had left and things started to go a little bit sideways. Long story short, the pastor actually moved back to Perry a few years later down the road, and he didn't pastor another church or anything, but he did buy the Christian bookstore in town, which I and Leanne both worked for him, at the bookstore. And matter of fact, she was working for him when we got engaged, and she was so excited but a little bit ticked that I proposed to her on her lunch break, and she had to go back to work that day. We can talk about that later. It's a different podcast.
We will bring
Leanne on. But he's like, shoot, Brother Bob, Misty were like, no, you're not coming back to work today, And anyway, big part of our family and loved him. But from there, we went to a few different churches. We tried different churches. It was at that point in my life that we attended a Lutheran church for a minute. We attended a Methodist church for a minute. We went to, a couple of the other Baptist churches. There was like a house church, and like we just kind of floating around. Yeah. And Chip was the first one in the family to be like, man, I'm going to go to that Southern Baptist church. Because the youth group, I had a bunch of friends who were there. And, got to love the pastor, and he loved me. He's a great guy. He took an interest in the young men there. And so really that's kind of, where God called me into ministry. But I was the first Southern Baptist in my family. The family followed, after that. And then I went to an independent Baptist college where the Southern Baptist guys were the liberal guys on campus. Yeah. And if they'd have known I grew up in a charismatic church, they might have burned me at the stake, while I was there. Yeah. But I will say, because AJ, I'm very skeptical of a lot of what we see as, quote, the Spirit in our churches today. And I'm very cynical about a lot of things just by nature. Matter of fact, I tell people it's a miracle I'm a Christian just because I'm a skeptic and a cynic at heart. But one of the best things that I learned in that charismatic church was that personal relationship with God. And it's not about a cold, dead orthodoxy. It's about a living relationship. And can I tell you how much I needed that when I was at an independent Baptist college, who was great on the scriptures. They were solid on the scriptures and spiritual disciplines, but the warmth of relationship, it wasn't really there. And so, it is funny because God kind of used all of those things, in a unique way to kind of mold me in my background into who I am today. And, lo and behold, the Orchard is kind of a place where some of that is all beneficial, because yes, we are, but no, we're not, and that can be said about many things, What's funny is I'm not sure how many of the people listening to this podcast didn't stop and go, wait, did he just say the Orchard was a Baptist church?
There what? Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of my experience growing up in churches, specifically charismatic church, and what that looked like for me, because it didn't look like all what you see in your head and TikTok reels and whatever, it wasn't that. There were moments where it's like, oh, okay, we're doing this right now. Yeah. But I will say that the pastor I grew up under had a strong commitment to the Word of God. He was a strong teacher of the Word of God. He wasn't a fiery preacher, but he was a teacher, and he was a strong, the Word was primary in what we did. And because the Word was primary, I think that put the proper, and this is what we talked about this week's message, we put the proper boundaries around what the gifts of the Spirit operated within.
Yeah, that's good. That's awesome. Let's get to know Chip a little bit. I like that. I do have two questions from what you said. So as you were talking, sharing your story, one thing popped out. Actually, two things popped out, but we'll ask this one first. So this guy was a prophet that showed up, circling all the way back to the beginning of the story. But one of the things that we kind of put a point of emphasis on is that you don't have a superpower. So I guess unpack that for me, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot there, but here's a guy who would prophesy but he seemed to do it regularly enough that he had the label prophet. And so in the world of we're telling people, hey, you don't have a spiritual superpower, you get what you have and what you need in the moment to kind of fill the gap. I guess unpack that for me.
Yeah, I think that as we have talked about this, it's not a superpower thing. It's not an attribute thing. I think the beginning place to understand that is I don't believe that our spiritual gifts are something that you can practice on demand, right? Like because it's initiated by the Spirit. And whether you're charismatic, Baptist, Methodist, whatever, that's not the way it's taught in almost any circle, But I think that we take it too far if we would say, okay, but there are certain gifts that God may use through you more regularly, And so just quite frankly, I have some question marks around a lot of this experience with a prophet coming to our church or whatever. And again, I believe it was one of the most genuine, godly men that I had met, But I have some question marks around, I'm not sure that's how spiritual gifts really operate, because for me, I think that those spiritual gifts are something that has to be prompted by the Spirit for the good of others, right? It has to be initiated by the Spirit. It's not up to us to all right, press the button, go. And maybe, I'm going to play devil's advocate against myself.
Yeah.
Maybe, he put himself in a position for the Spirit to initiate prophecy in his life. Maybe that's what it was. And he was like, I'm not doing it. I'm just putting myself in position for it. And he hadn't failed me yet, So that could very well be. That's why I say I have question marks and not like, no, that's not.
Right.
I don't think it's a superpower. I think it's something that the Spirit can do. I think because he does it once, he doesn't have to do it again.
Yeah.
I think he can do it as many times as he wants. And probably sometimes there are more gifts that he uses through one person than others. But I have question marks around hey, this guy just gets to prophesy whenever he wants.
Yeah. So that was my first question. That's good. My second question is, you seem to have found like a ton of value in this church experience, right? And that's a good thing. Sounds like some really cool things came out of that. And then you have us or your other church experiences, right? Like why, I don't even know how to ask this question, so fill in the blanks as you see fit, but like, why don't we lean into more of that? Why don't we, or what would be your preference, or like, how do you reconcile that, I guess, for yourself, like, or anybody who's looking, all right, well, I'm looking to find a church to plug into. Here's this guy saying he had a really valuable experience in a charismatic church, and this church over here doesn't really seem to really lean into any of the gifts, and they stay away from all that kind of stuff, and they're really rigid. What's the balance? Where's the balance? Do you invite the balance? Do you reject the balance? What?
So I think to be helpful, I think you would have to be a little bit more specific with me on that. Because
sure.
Here's the issue that I have, is when we talk about, that church doesn't lean into spiritual gifts, what do we mean? Tongues.
Maybe, or healings or prophecy. Like,
well, no, I would disagree, because I think most Christians, whether charismatic, Pentecostal, whatever, there's only one far extreme that believes that you can be healed on demand by this man of God who has the gift of healing.
Sure.
Because as we've said before, if anybody has the gift of healing, the superpower of healing, then get out of your church and go to St. Jude's.
Yeah, 100%.
And they would say, well, you have to have the faith to be healed. And they would point to some verses, in Scripture, which, again, most people have verses to look at. But I think by and large, when we talk about they're not open to the gifts of the Spirit, they're not open to the Spirit, what we mean, practically speaking, in American churches is that they're not expressive in worship, they do not practice tongues in the service, and they don't let just anybody who has a word hold the microphone. Honestly, I think that's what it is, because I would say at the most Baptist of Baptist, well, I don't say the most Baptist of Baptist churches, but at a lot of regular churches, the gifts of the Spirit are on activity, on display all the time. There's the gift of knowledge as the pastor, pours out what he has learned in the week to the people. There's a gift of hospitality as they welcome one another. There's the gift of encouragement as they come alongside of one another. So I think the gifts are on full display when we understand them not as specific superpowers that show how spiritual we are.
Yeah.
And that's my biggest hang up that I see with the way that the charismatic Pentecostal stream in many places, I won't even say in most, in many places is going is, well, that if you're not expressive in worship, if you're not speaking in tongues, if you don't let people just come up and tell you, this is what the Lord told me to tell you, well, then you're not as spiritual as we are.
Yeah.
And that is the whole point that Paul is making in 1 Corinthians, is none of that matters when it comes to how spiritually mature you are. Yeah. So I guess that would be my first reaction. Like, I think the gifts of the Spirit are on display. I think a lot of the value I got from the charismatic church I grew up in is value that we have here at the Orchard, the warmth of relationship, the letting people know God still speaks when we listen, being constrained by the word. I think all of that is on display. I think for us, the only thing that's not on display is we don't practice the speaking of tongues in our worship service. We don't hand the microphone over to anybody who says, I think I've got a word from the Lord. So, I mean, anything more specific with that you're thinking, or does that?
Yeah, I just open-ended question. Like, I guess the prophecy thing was what triggered that question. Like, you have Southern Baptist churches who aren't inviting prophets in, but there seems to be, for a lot of people, a ton of value in that. So I guess, like, what's the not the hang up, but what's the distinguishing marker between we're open to that, but we're not inviting that, I guess? Like, what would be the discrepancy would be my question for people listening. Like, why does that church do that and they find value in it? And maybe people like you who said, I find value in that in certain moments. But this church is like, no, that's off limits. We're not even touching that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't think that I would say at the Orchard, for me, and I guess I can say this as lead pastor, which is funny because I don't really even think about that anymore, like that it's my decision or whatever. Right. I wouldn't say it's completely off limits. I would say I have yet to be convinced of the certain authenticity of any of those things that I have seen practiced enough to invite them in.
Sure.
And the inviting them in is the key part, right? Like, I'm not going to go out and say, well, I'm not sure about this thing, but let's invite it in and just try it.
Hunt a prophet.
Yeah, I think that we have seen gifts of prophecy used at the Orchard. I'm fixing to put you on the spot because I do not believe that I'm a prophet nor the son of a prophet, as the joke goes. But about 3 years ago, I think I told you, hey, see that person right there? Mm-hmm. I think they're going to be on staff with us one day.
100%. Yeah.
And I don't know why. I don't know. Just got a little nudge. I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
It hadn't happened yet. Looks like it is, like it could be any time of the next month or so, you know?
Right.
And so because we don't label that prophecy, is it not? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying? And so I think, and you and I have had this conversation, I think one of the biggest differences in the more restrained yet charismatic church that I grew up in and open but suspicious church like the Orchard,
suspicious,
right? I think it's just how we talk about it sometimes. Like, there's the obvious differences, don't get me wrong. But you and I have talked about this just in our relationship. Like, I feel like sometimes I fail you guys, like you and Matt and Lucas and, Shane or Mary Beth, or, when I say, well, I think, and then go ahead and say, and you guys are like, oh, well, he just, is kind of, well, this is what I'm thinking, and not, no, when I say I think, it's something I've prayed over.
Right.
It's something that I'm being sensitive about. This is kind of where I feel God push or pull or whatever. But I just say, I think.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to attribute it to God if I miss the boat here. I'm not blaming God for my bad decisions.
Let's be honest, there's a heaviness with that.
There is. If a pastor says, God told me, that ends all conversation.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
Sure. Yeah.
Like, let's just say like the churches have.
That's the trump card.
Yeah. Right. Like, how are you going to refute that without it getting ugly?
Yeah.
And I think that's why I'm so hesitant to throw that out.
Yeah.
Yet that doesn't mean that it still doesn't happen. We just kind of limit the language on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because sometimes we're not sure, and we had a whole podcast about this, we're not sure if it's God or if it is me or
Taco Bell.
Yeah, Taco Bell. That's, maybe that should be the podcast t-shirt, God or Taco Bell, question mark. But I think the point is, it's not that we're not open to it. Mm-hmm. It's just that we are a little more cautious about claiming it.
Yeah.
Like, this is what God said, And so you and I, as we've had this conversation, I've tried to be more careful to say, I really kind of just feel like this may be it. I think feel instead of think, sounds a little bit better. But also, I've point blank told you and told Michael or whoever, hey, just full transparency, I haven't prayed about this. I've prayed about this just a little bit. So this is just Chip's thoughts, And so just trying to distinguish those things, I think, have been helpful.
It has been incredibly helpful.
But if it was in a charismatic church and we're in those same meetings, or a conversation rewind 3 years ago, if we were in a charismatic church, I would have said, AJ, I believe that the Lord is telling me that that this is going to come to pass.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's just the language around it sometimes.
I think so. What I would maybe add, and not this is even my half the conversation is yours, but I think I see this when you have a Bethel say, well, the Lord's told us this is what's going to happen, and then it doesn't happen. And now I'm wrestling with, okay, well, what is the Lord, and what are you hearing from the Lord? And now there's a question for me of not just what the Lord has said or not said, but your leadership and your hearing of the Lord. And so I think it's good that we're careful, because if you're not, there's a very slippery slope on that other end of the spectrum that says, I've now attributed things to God and put him on the spot, and either he's not who he says he is, or I'm a false prophet. And both those things are very dangerous.
And in the Old Testament, do you know what happened to false prophets?
Brother.
They were stoned.
Yeah.
So since our conversation of does God speak to us, how do we know, can we know God speaking to us?
Yeah.
And I just pitted myself against you, Matt, and Eddie, and I was like, I don't think we can ever fully know. Well, as I've thought about this more, I've got a good illustration that I think kind of helps explain my point. Because as we've talked about it after the podcast, you all know where I'm coming from with this. So have you seen these, I'm sure you have, everybody has, the water filters that are removes 99.9% of, you pour your water through it, 99.9% pure, right?
Yeah.
And so you get that water, it's 99.9% pure. What if there was a reverse filter where you get the purest of pure spring water, but it has to go through this filter that still has some contaminants. But when that water gets in the pitcher, it's not 100% pure, but it's 99.9% pure.
Yeah.
Well, at that point, that would be what I'd say. Well, it's not 100% pure. And so when God speaks to us, he has to filter through our sinful flesh. Mm-hmm. And what comes out and how we understand filters through our sinful flesh. This past week, we looked at a word that Paul used, that he used and translated understanding. In the Greek, it's the word nous, which just means mind.
Yeah.
Well, there's a whole section of theology called the noetic effects of sin. And it's not Noah as in the ark, it's Noah as in nous, the same root word. And the study is how how our sin nature doesn't just affect our soul, it affects our minds, the way we think, our ability to think, our ability to process. And so even our ability to process God speaking to us is tainted by our sinful flesh.
Yeah.
And so then the question becomes, okay, are we filtering that 100% pure water through a 99% almost clean filter, or is it more like a 80% or 75%? And so that's why I just want to be very careful what I'm attributing to God. And for me, I got to be, which is funny, because we joke around the office that Michael is Mr. Certainty and I'm Mr. Clarity.
Right.
Michael doesn't say anything unless he's sure.
Yeah.
And if I'm 51%, I'm going to just sit it. Out loud, but I'll argue it to death at 51%.
But this is probably the conversation.
But with God, I'm going to have to be 98% sure before I do it. And even at 98% sure, I'm going to be but maybe not.
Yeah.
Because I also believe one of the biggest ways that God speaks to us is through affirmation of others.
100%.
He's not going to tell us one thing and them something else.
It's funny. We were at camp, and there was a senior. His name was Seth, I think. And I never met Seth before, and probably won't ever meet him again, I would guess. But he came up to me, and he was actually, he didn't come up to me. I was walking in on a conversation of him and one of the staff, and he was talking about how he's all in on Eastern Orthodoxy. And
really?
It was bizarre. The guy is a very intelligent senior.
Eastern Orthodox is making a resurgence.
Yeah. And so, just kind of listening and observing and asking the why. And he starts to basically tell me well, I don't think Scripture's the only inerrant thing out there. I think the councils were all inerrant and infallible and yada, yada, yada. And I basically had this exact... Well, yeah. I basically had this exact conversation with him. I'm like, man, A, that's the litmus test. B, I think you're severely underestimating the amount of sin that we bring to the table, even in our discernment. And that's why Arminius and Calvin are both in heaven and had two completely different theologies, right? And so
except we got John from accounting, that one guy who nailed it.
That guy's the exception for the rule. Yeah. Man, that's good. All right, so here's kind of, and we're already 55 minutes into this. We said this before we got going. Well, it'll happen. It always happens. But I want to ask this question because I think it's a question on the backside of the series, or at some point in this series, our people have been asking, and it's this: if there's someone out there and they're thinking, I want to encounter the Spirit, I want to be in a position to experience spiritual gifts, or whether that's to grow in the fruit of the Spirit, I want to encounter the Spirit, what would you tell them?
Well, number one, I would say they are 100% asking the right question. Like that's what Paul says, right? In 14:1, pursue love and desire spiritual gifts. Not neglect them, not be afraid of them, not pretend they don't exist. Desire them, but make sure you're pursuing love. And so I think if somebody says, Chip, I really want to encounter the Spirit, I think the first thing I would say is why? Do you want to encounter the Spirit so that you can have this deeper spiritual experience? If so, then you're already on dangerous ice, because that's the error that Paul's trying to correct in the Corinthian church, right? Your spiritual gifts are not designed to make you closer to the Spirit. That's what we've learned, right? But if you'd say, I want to encounter the Spirit because I want to see the Spirit work through me in my life, okay, that's better, all right? So then to do that, we need to do what we've said. Let's put ourselves in a position to be used by the Spirit. Let's get out of our comfort zone and go places where our ability falls short of the need. Where our capabilities, our competencies, our, everything we have is just not quite enough to get the job done. We need God to step in. Because when you step into those spaces, that's where I believe you will see the Spirit truly at work. And I would go so far as to say, even circling back, AJ, to your question, like, why is it we don't see that stuff in our churches today? Well, I think it's primarily because we have very consumeristic church culture in America and the West today. I don't think God's going to show up and pour out His Spirit so that you can have a cool worship experience and then go to Chili's.
Look at me.
That's right. And when I look around at these churches that are expressing the Spirit, I'm really wondering, okay, is it the Spirit, or do you just want to be in front of everybody? Do you just want everybody to see how spiritual you are? Because that's the Corinthian error, right? I believe the reason that I say I am, and I think I speak for us at The Orchard, because I asked all of our pastors, that we would say that we are open but skeptical of a lot of what we see in the broader charismatic Pentecostal movement today. We're open to it. We're not denying that any of that's real. We're just very skeptical about how some of it is practiced, for sure. What I would say is the reason that we are open to it is because we believe that there's still a mission field that needs it.
Absolutely.
And that when we're on the mission field, whether in another country or in the inner city, doesn't matter, that's where we see the Spirit show up. And that's where we see the Spirit move. And that's when the Spirit's like, hey, I got you, fam. This is that gift that's going to come out in that moment. Here's that gift of knowledge. It's like the short story I shared last week. The first time I really was like, oh, no, that was a spiritual gift, was when I'm just trying to share the gospel with somebody, And so I think if you want to encounter the Spirit, get on mission field, live on mission, seek the good of those around you, put yourself in position where what they need is more than what you have. And I think that's when you'll see the Spirit step in and start to fill that gap.
I love the way you said, I think it was last Sunday, there's a gap between what you can offer and what they need. And I feel like we lie to ourselves all the time and tell ourselves there's not a gap, or the gap is very small and we can offer everything that they need, and it's just not true. And if there's a gap between what you can offer and what they need, the Spirit, I think, desires to fill the gap for them, because I think Jesus wants everyone to come to faith in Him. And the mission field for sure is a phenomenal answer. That's good. Well, we're 59 minutes in. We're just under an hour. You got 7 seconds to round it out and keep us here.
Amen.
Amen, brother. We'll catch you guys next week.
We'll see you then.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk About That. We hope it encouraged and challenged you as we continue to grow in this journey of faith and embrace community. If you have more questions, thoughts, or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us through our social media channels or visit our website and stay connected. Your questions are what make this podcast a dynamic and enriching experience. If you found today's discussion meaningful, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Your engagement helps us spread the message and connect with others who may find value in these conversations. Until next time, we hope this episode inspired you and will help you bring Sunday's message into your week ahead. Keep the conversation alive, and remember, we're all on this journey together.